Hello, and welcome to Building an Effective Relationship with Your Student. My name is Nick Thornton. I'm a career educator with the Workplace Learning Team out of the UBC Career Center. And this webinar is going to be all about some of the best practices and things you can think about as you approach working with a student, either in the WorkLearn program or the Undergraduate Research Awards, but would also apply to working with a student in many different contexts. So the learning objectives for this webinar are to explore the elements of what make an effective relationship between a supervisor and a student, to identify some of the critical components of supportive supervision, to differentiate between mentorship and supervision, and to also apply criteria for effective feedback in delivery to students. Something to think about as we go through this content and as you continue on your journey of being a supervisor is to think about a time when you felt like you had a really effective working relationship with someone, whether that's a supervisor that you had or somebody you were supervising, or maybe even just a colleague. But what were some of the elements that made that an effective working relationship? And I would put the emphasis here on effective, not necessarily we had the same types of personalities or we just enjoyed each other's company, but what were the pieces around communication and working styles that allowed you to work together effectively? Often, when we think about effective working relationships, we think of the relationships that have not been effective, the times where we've really struggled with a supervisor or struggled as a supervisor ourselves, and things have not gone well. And if that's what's coming to mind for you, I would encourage you to think about what would be the opposite actions or the opposite behaviors of those ineffective working relationships. As we move through this content, I think it's important to keep coming back to this example and again, really be thinking about behaviors. What are the actions that we can do in our work every day, every week to make sure that we have a strong foundation and we're not just relying on necessarily similarities between us as people or working styles, but really thinking about, again, behaviors and the structure for that working relationship. A few things that building an effective relationship can look like. This is, of course, going to be dependent on the workplace, but I think there's some commonalities across effective relationships. Generally, we'd be ensuring that the work environment empowers employees to work to the best of their abilities and towards the goals of the unit or department. And this might mean we need to be flexible in our approach. We might have a system that's worked really well in the past, and we might be working with a new student or team that needs different tools. And I think if we can focus on ensuring that employees feel empowered to work to the best of their abilities, that will help us help guide us towards approaches that are going to work for everyone. I think it also begins with clear expectations. This is really the foundation for all communication. We know in the WorkLearn program that when things are not going as anticipated for a supervisor and or a student, it's often because there's no clear expectations or not enough clear expectations around what needs to happen. So expectations can include things around what are the job duties, what's actually being expected in terms of the work that the student will be doing, the quality of work. I think a good example of this would be giving a task that you expect to take maybe a couple of weeks and really be done quite thoroughly, and a student coming back to you the next day saying, I've already finished this. It might be overall like not a bad effort, but sometimes it helps to be really clear about the timelines for something. So, I'm expecting a polished 3-page report versus just saying, I'd like a summary of these things, and it would be great if you could get it to me in 2 weeks. So breaking things down into smaller pieces and being really, really clear about what does a quality example look like to you. Anytime you can provide examples of what you're looking for to a student, that's always really helpful. We shouldn't assume anything about a student's past experiences or what they might be able to do, unless, of course, you've worked with them before. but it never hurts to just be upfront about your expectations to start with, and providing an example can be a really clear way of demonstrating this is the thing that I'd like you to move towards or have it look like or feel like. Also includes expectations around professionalism. Professionalism is one of those terms that we throw around a lot and we like to reference, but we don't always clearly define, and everybody has their own definition of exactly what professionalism looks like. Keep in mind, too, that depending on a student's experience, professionalism in their past workplaces might have been a really high level of professionalism for those contexts, and it might be different now in your new context. So this is always a worthwhile conversation to have at the beginning of a supervisory relationship with somebody around what does professionalism mean to both of you? So this is a good opportunity to reflect on your own definition of professionalism, but also asking your students about what does working in a professional environment look like to you? What are some elements of professionalism that you value? And recognizing that there is no set standard definition of what this is. And if we have really particular things that we consider to be part of professionalism, like showing up exactly on time for every shift, that's clearly stated to a student so that they're aware of it. And to that point, mutually developed expectations can be really helpful to get buy-in from students. If expectations are all just coming from the supervisor and there's nothing coming from the student, this is where problems can also arise, where it's just somebody telling somebody else what to do and not considering the expectations that the student may have as well. Building effective relationships also looks like including feedback and recognition. Feedback is really, really important to students. We know this from the programs that we run, that students are choosing to work with people like you because they want feedback. They want to know areas that they can improve. They want to have professional development opportunities suggested to them. They really want and value feedback in the role. So that includes both positive, but also critical feedback about, again, areas where they can grow. And if there's examples to back up this feedback, that can also be really helpful. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what effective feedback can look like a little later and some specific elements to include, but just ensuring that this is part of building an effective relationship with your student, and is also a great reflection question to ask to students who are starting to work with you for the first time. What does feedback look like to them? What kinds of feedback would they like to get? And when and how would they like to get that feedback? Recognition is also super important. This is something that I sometimes struggled with as a supervisor. It was a busy work environment, and it was always really easy to see the thing that wasn't getting done or the area for improvement. And I sometimes forgot that students also really value just knowing if something worked really well or they did a good job with something. Even small, little in the moment informal recognition can really mean a lot, not just in terms of building confidence, but also helping establish those expectations to know this is the standard that we're looking for. So an example of this could be you maybe have a student who's working at a service point and they're spending time with a patron to really understand their problem. And then they make a phone call to make sure that they're making a really good referral. And you're overhearing this interaction. This could be a really good time when the interaction ends to just say to the student, hey, I really appreciate that you took time to understand that patron's question and concerns. And then you also made sure that you were making a really accurate referral by calling somebody else. So this is both recognizing like, hey, you did this thing really well, but also this is the standard that you've set now. This is how you should be making a good referral. And of course, this also includes career development and growth. So this kind of ties into expectations and giving feedback and recognition, but having reflective conversations with your student about what they're hoping to learn, what they're hoping to get out of working with you, and any opportunities for professional growth that they're specifically interested in. This is a huge part of the work learn and the undergraduate research opportunities is really making sure students feel bought into things and that they've got some ownership over their goals and what they're working towards. Of course, students are going to grow in their roles just by doing the work and getting the experience. But as ever, it's really helpful to set some specific goals around this and learn from students, what does career development look like to them? That might be technical training, it might be the opportunity to present at a lab meeting, or it might be something else entirely. So it's a great question to ask students about when they begin their role. So thinking about the role of supervision in building an effective relationship, it's a really critical aspect of a student employee's experience and career learning in WorkLearn, as well as the undergraduate research awards. As I said before, the reason why these roles are competitive is because students want to work with people like yourself. They want to work with experts in the field, and they want to work in a high caliber workplace like at UBC. So the supervision really sets the tone for whether or not a student is going to have a good and an impactful experience in the program. So it would strive towards achieving important student outcomes through, again, discussion of expectations, relevant and timely orientation and training, making sure students are equipped to do their job well and not just being thrown into something right away, but giving any relevant reading, doing on-the-job training, maybe some job shadowing, getting introduced to key team members, making sure they feel like they're actually part of a team if they're working with somebody other than just yourself. And of course, that ongoing feedback component. Supervision is also different than mentorship. Mentorship is part of supervision, but supervision, I think here we really think about what are the expectations of the job? What are the requirements and the things that just sort of need to happen as a part of the role and the ongoing supervision that requires. Mentorship is a little bit more about those professional development and the career growth pieces. As a student supervisor, you are now a key pillar of mentorship and career development for the students that you're working with. And they really do value what you have to say about career growth and career opportunities. So this could mean sharing parts of your story, your own career path. This could be maybe connecting them to other people who have similar types of careers or might be interested in similar things to the student. But I really think of mentorship as focusing on growth and also something that is reciprocal. I've learned lots from students that I've supervised who are bringing in a wealth of experience from different fields, who just know different things than I do. And so when we think about check-ins and the ongoing supervisory relationship, I think if we can really frame it as a mentorship opportunity that's reciprocal, we can both learn a lot from each other. Of course, this part of supervision also means you're responsible for the safety, well-being, and performance of an individual. These are also really key components of supervision. Of course, there's mandatory safety training at UBC, but it's also really important to be doing any site-specific safety training and conversations with students so that they feel well-equipped to deal with something and can start to anticipate some of the scenarios that might come up that have to do with their safety and well-being. This can include conversations with them about their own well-being. And again, when we can anticipate things, it makes them easier to deal with when they do come up. So talking about well-being and going, what's going to be our plan if suddenly midterm season hits and you get really stressed out with the workload? How can I best support you? What will be our communication channels? How can we adjust things? This is always an easier conversation to have at the beginning when things are going well, rather than trying to deal with well-being when there's an issue. So I really think of safety and well-being as being preventative and building a solid foundation, rather than something that's solely just reactive to a situation after it's already happened. So communication. This is obviously a huge part of professionalism, part of professional growth, part of what students will be getting from you, but also a really key component in building that effective relationship. There's so many things that we could talk about with communication, but I'm going to focus in on just a few key points to get us started. So this is something that, again, I've had to learn the hard way and is always a work in progress. but is to really focus on trying to understand what the person is saying, which might be different from what you're hearing. Especially when we've been in our role for a while or we have a lot of experience with something, it's easy to start to interpret more than actually listen. And we might be hearing something in a way that is very different from what a student is saying. So, as much as possible, trying to carve out dedicated time to having conversations with your student where it's free from distractions. It's not while they're maybe at a service point or in the middle of a task, but separate from that, really trying to talk to each other, especially if it's something that's maybe more sensitive or is feedback about their performance, where you both can really listen closely to what each other is saying and to clarify that you understand that rather than just assuming that we know what they mean. Sometimes people will talk about the method of repeating back to somebody what you've just heard. So it sounds like you are going through a really tough time right now with your course load, and maybe working one shift less per week would for the next month could really help you. Is that right? So checking for understanding with the students we're working with, again, rather than just assuming that we both understand what each other mean. Which brings me to the second point, which is check for understanding, then check again. It's very easy for us to have a conversation, assume that everybody's clear on what needs to happen. I'm a big fan of a follow-up email after a conversation so that we both have somewhere in writing what we talked about and what the next steps are, our plan of action. And that way we both have something we can refer back to and we can both be accountable to. This is something that we do naturally as humans. We make assumptions. As much as possible, we should try to avoid that. It's common when working with students that we just see a part of their lives when they show up to work, and we shouldn't assume that the way they're showing up to work is necessarily how they are in every other sphere. And we might see a behavior and not understand the full story. I have a couple of scenarios to think through towards the end of this webinar. We'll get into a little bit more detail about what I mean by unpacking assumptions, but just something helpful to think about and to be checking in with yourself, especially as you're beginning to work with a new student, is thinking about, I might have worked with a whole bunch of students in the past. I shouldn't assume that this student is going to be exactly the same. This also includes asking questions when something is unclear. Often we're thinking about this in terms of encouraging students to ask questions when something is unclear, but I think it's also really important for us to be asking questions to students and being as curious as we can, rather than, again, jumping to assumptions. So if we're about to give feedback about how a student is consistently late, rather than coming in right away with our feedback, opening up with some questions about what's going on for that student so that we can best understand the situation that they're in. A few notes about delivering effective feedback. These are best practices. These are also things that are flexible, and you might have your own things to add to this. But again, it's just kind of a starting point to think about how to deliver effective feedback. By far, the most important thing is for it to be timely, especially for giving something that's maybe more sensitive or some critical feedback about work or performance. If we're waiting 2 weeks, a month, or more to give that feedback, it's really too late. It's very hard to adjust behaviors when something has happened weeks or months ago. We should really be trying to do it within a day or two of the thing that we've noticed happening or at our next available check-in. It's really important just to let the other party know that you'd like to debrief. Make sure that you provide it, as I said, closer to either the incident or the task. Maybe they submitted a report to you and it wasn't quite up to the standards that you'd hoped for. So send the student an email and say, hey, I'd love to chat a little bit more about your report. I have some feedback I'd like to discuss with you. Can we meet this Friday at 1 p.m.? Really trying to be timely, up to date, and specific with our ask and what we'd like to talk about. If it's a highly emotional situation, we may want to wait a little bit before engaging in feedback. An example of this could be maybe a student you work with had to deal with something difficult in the workplace. They had to maybe set an expectation with a patron or have a conversation with a fellow student where there was some conflict. Going to the student right after that thing has happened to provide feedback about how they handled the interaction, even if it's positive feedback, can also be a little bit of an overload. That might be a situation where we want to wait a day or two before we do the debrief. It might be helpful to say, like, hey, I know today was a really stressful day or something didn't go as planned. Do you want to meet tomorrow to talk about this? So just giving a little bit of distance between the thing happening and discussing it right away. This can still be timely. You probably don't want to wait a week or more, but giving things a little bit of buffer time rather than trying to have a conversation with somebody who's really activated and maybe needing a little bit of space from the thing that you're going to talk about. We also want to make sure we're maintaining a respectful environment. We want to maintain the most generous expectations possible, both of our colleagues and of ourselves. A way that that can show up, or just an example of that, is just saying something like, you're irresponsible, really, providing a value-based judgment of somebody isn't really effective feedback. It's certainly not making generous assumptions. And it's really helpful to focus in on what was the specific incident or behavior and what was the impact of that. So rather than saying you're irresponsible, we might say something like, when you were late for our presentation, we were unable to set up in time to receive participants. And that meant that participants coming in had a really negative experience of the presentation. So being really clear about what the behavior, what the issue was, and then what the impact of that was, versus just saying something that is criticizing a person. Saying something like, you're always late, rather than, when you're consistently showing up to shifts late, it has an impact on our entire team. And it means that people who need to leave to get to class can't, and it impacts everybody's work, not just your own. So part of having effective feedback is just having a discussion. Providing the other person an opportunity to respond is really important. This is also a huge piece of professional growth, that feedback is not just a one-way street and me saying you need to be better, but also allowing a student the opportunity to respond, not just so that they have their fair opportunity to respond, but so that they can actually start to brainstorm what the actions are going to be. And I think this is a really key part of mentorship, is not always providing the solution to students, but saying, here's what I've noticed, and I'd love to hear what your actions, behaviors, what your solutions are going to be to this issue. This could even be in a positive challenge kind of way. This could be going to a student saying, I've been tasked with creating this resource and I'd like you to help me. This is the problem we're trying to solve. What are some of the ways you would approach this? Or what ideas do you have to try to solve this problem? Good feedback also includes follow-up. We want to connect this to goals or challenges that the student's been facing whenever possible. We also want to look for progress. We can't just focus on the fact that the expectation has not been yet met, but we want to also look for ways that they've improved, and highlighting that to the student so that they feel encouraged to continue on that. So recognizing the improvements that students have made, rather than always just looking at what's the deficit, what's the thing that's not happening. We do want to recognize when we're seeing growth, to say, I've noticed that your report writing has come a really long way since the beginning of term. I've really been impressed with how much attention to detail you've had. I have a couple of points that I'd like you to continue to work on. Here's what they are. And of course, delivering effective feedback looks different for everybody, and it takes practice. Feedback is an ongoing process. It's not something that just happens once and then we forget about. And it's important that we practice both giving and receiving the feedback, and the methods and ways in which we do that. So this might look like maybe carving out time in your regular check-ins with students to also receive feedback. Maybe have some prompting questions like, Are there things that I'm doing as a supervisor that you find particularly helpful? Are there things I'm doing as a supervisor that you're finding particularly unhelpful? Questions like that can really allow a student to co-create a working space and a working relationship that works for both of you, versus, again, just saying to the student, here's all the things that I expect and I need you to adhere to. Okay, we're going to wrap up this webinar by thinking about a few scenarios. And I've tried to draw on things that I've heard from supervisors, things that I've experienced myself as a supervisor, and these are just things to think through to try to anticipate some of the challenges or situations that we might face, and to think about what would our follow-up be and how would we maybe address those. So let's think about this first scenario here. Let's say that you've got a student who's been in their role for, say, about 4 months, and overall, you're pretty pleased with their performance. They're doing most of the things that you expected to a fairly high standard. They are a little on the shy side, but they consistently produce high quality work. However, you feel that your check-ins with the students are a little one-sided, with you doing most of the talking and the student more or less agreeing with everything you say. You'd like to challenge your student and really see them open up as a professional. So what are some ways, some actions or behaviors that you could provide to the student or enact that would help the student open up a little bit more? And I'll give you a second to think about it. A few ideas to help us think through this this is something that's quite common in workplaces where we have students who maybe don't feel the confidence to speak up or provide their feedback. They might have come from an environment where this was something that was not encouraged, and they really were just receiving things from a supervisor and then expected to go and enact those things. One thing I think about is what's the work I can do before a check-in? When I had students that were shy to open up in our check-ins, I created this for all students where I actually had set questions that I would send to students in advance that I wanted us to talk through. And this helped for setting expectations, but also helped students prepare before our check-ins. And this would often lead eventually to me saying, you're actually going to set the agenda for our check-in. Here's the same set of questions I'd like us to always talk about, but I want you to come to me with what your agenda is. It might be as formal as sending me an email to say, hey, these are the things that are on my agenda today, or it just might mean bringing that to our one-on-one or our check-in to talk through. But giving some agency and ownership to the student and setting that expectation to say, our check-ins are actually going to be run by you, so I want you to come with an agenda of the things that you want to talk about, the questions that you have, and the ways that I can help you achieve your goals for the next couple of weeks. There's lots of other ways that you can do this, but this is a common thing that comes up where students are maybe feeling a lack of confidence, especially at the beginning, and are just kind of agreeing and being like, yes, I understand these things, and may not, and may just be wanting to say yes and to sort of people please rather than do the deep work or bring their own feedback and opinions to a conversation, which might be what we actually expect, but a student might need help practicing this. So we could also be thinking about what are ways and environments that I can challenge my student to speak up a little bit more, not just in our check-ins, but maybe I might ask them to chair our next team meeting so that they have more time to talk and to set the tone for a conversation and have a chance to practice this skill. Okay, so let's think about this next scenario. Another student that you work with is a really outgoing person and has done a pretty okay job so far in their role. They can miss the occasional important detail, but overall, you're not too concerned about their performance. One thing that that has seemed to be a problem is that the student can be quite adversarial at times with you and other supervisors. So maybe when asked to do something, they can be a little bit defensive and short with you, and you're worried that this behavior might carry over to future workplaces. You might even think this is something the student might not be aware of, but is maybe communicating something that they may not be meaning to communicate. So to summarize, a student who's doing a pretty good job overall, but it gets a little bit defensive when you're offering feedback. So what are some things you would do, or what are some ways you would approach a conversation or some follow-up with this student? A couple of things that I think about is that when people are being defensive, it's whether they realize it or not, it's often because they're feeling like they're not living up to expectations or they're not doing a good job. And we carry a lot of stuff from past experiences. They might have come from a workplace where their supervisor really didn't trust them much or had really unclear expectations. And they're now beginning this new role and still have that former supervisor in their head. And that's causing them to react rather than to just be able to openly receive feedback. Sometimes this is also students overestimating their own abilities and thinking that because they've done something similar to this in the past, they know exactly what needs to happen. I think openness is always the best antidote to defensiveness and to interactions that might feel a little bit adversarial, and to just name it with the student. So inviting them in maybe your check-in or a separate conversation to just say, so here's what I've noticed. The last time we chatted, I gave you some feedback about this project that we're working on, and I felt like you felt a little bit defensive or maybe didn't receive the feedback that I was giving you and took that personally. And I just wanted to have a conversation about it. How did that conversation feel? What are some of the things that you value and what's going on for you right now? Especially where things maybe feel a little bit adversarial or like there's some simmering conflict, it's always best to address it head on and as soon as possible and say, um, I noticed that when you were interacting with your colleague yesterday, things seemed to be a little bit tense. And I just wanted to follow up to see, what's going on there for both of you. Is there anything that I can do to help support? And I just want to understand the situation better so that, we're all working together in a good way. Conflict is one of those things that nobody likes, but is obviously really important to address, whether that's conflict that we have with somebody or maybe conflict that they're experiencing with somebody else. But to have an open and curious dialogue about what's going on for all parties in that. In this scenario, we're thinking kind of more about a one-on-one situation where you as a supervisor feel like the student is being a little bit adversarial towards you. And it's also okay to be really clear about expectations as well. If a student is offering a lot of pushback about a key part of their role and just not fulfilling that expectation, it's okay to have a kind and generous conversation that's still really clear in saying, as a part of your role, you're expected to do this thing. And when I tell you to do that task, it's not a personal attack. It's just an expectation of the role. Moving forward, I'd like to see you just adhere to this and complete it to the best of your abilities. And, if you want to have a separate conversation about how you do that task or, challenges in getting that task done, I'm totally open to it. It's felt a little bit adversarial when I've asked you to do things, and I want to make sure we're on the same page about what the expectations are. So you can be clear and direct without necessarily returning the defensiveness or adversarial nature yourself. I hope this has been helpful to think through a couple of scenarios. Likely you will experience or already have some scenarios yourself. I encourage you to talk to other supervisors who are also supervising students about what they would do. Also reaching out to your department or your unit's HR person. They always have a wealth of experience and also know what all the UBC policies and department specific policies are. And also just are good people to have conversations with to just sort of maybe think through a couple of things, think about some tactics and approaches that might work best. As we wrap things up, I'd like you to reflect on what are some things that you would like to start doing as a supervisor? What's something you'd like to stop doing? And what's something that you would like to continue doing? as you think about those, thank you, first of all, for your time in watching this and listening. In providing exceptional supervision to students, it's a really key part of their career growth at UBC. So the work that you're doing to be a good supervisor really, really has an enormous impact on not just a student's experience at UBC, but their entire professional journey. It's a really profound thing that supervisors do and are incredibly open to not just teaching and guiding students and mentoring students, but also learning from students themselves. So truly, thank you for all the work that you do there. I also just wanted to mention there's some links in the video description below to resources that you might find helpful as a supervisor. Workplace Learning has lots of templates that you can look at. You're free to download those and adjust them as needed, or just use them as they already are. And of course, please reach out to our office if there's anything that we can help with to help you be the best supervisor that you can be. Thanks so much.